as the show has progressed over the years of me doing it, it's allowed me to take a look and do different types of episodes that normally are outside of the format that we conventionally do. And as I noted in the promo for this upcoming episode, and welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to this episode 346 of the Mike the New Haven podcast, we always like to do deep dives of some sorts in that we have our police and fire interviews, which are normally pretty conventional. Excuse me for a moment. That's the winter, folks. I get a bad cough in the winter usually. But what's nice about this episode is that, as many of you know, at least on the surface level, at least I did, there's several different law enforcement agencies or entities in the 5 boroughs of New York City. Now, we know about the NYPD, for example, or the MTA police or the Port Authority police, but there's specific offices with specific functions that are very vital to public safety in the city that we don't know a lot about. And it's not because they don't do great work. They certainly do. But sometimes that work has to be kept under wraps for confidentiality reasons, security reasons, or the offices are so small, they kind of operate in a subtle fashion. But tonight, with this episode, we get to take a look at a law enforcement agency in New York City that's been around for a long time and is very important in its mission. And I reached out to tonight's guest via LinkedIn, and tonight he'll tell me just what that office does, his role in it over the years, and some other interesting anecdotes as well. So we'd like to welcome everybody tuning in via YouTube, LinkedIn, and of course, Facebook. Hello to Joe Maliga, who's always here, Billy Ryan, Christian Williams, Steve Dorado, and Matt Shirley, the usual suspects, and John Costello. I can't forget about John Costello. The usual suspects tuning in on this fine Friday evening. Pretty cold here in at least the East Coast. Tonight's guest doesn't have to worry about that. He's down in Florida. So I already envy him. That might create some contention between us. And just before I get into the advertisements, if you haven't checked out the previous episode, that was volume 64 of our FDNY miniseries, The Best, the Bravest Interviews with the FDNY's Elite. Former FDNY Division Chief Jay Swithers, who is active on the FDNY EMS side of things. All righty, so let's get into the ads. And the first thing, as always, is MC Media Editing Services.
Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company.
And good to see Joe Murray in the chat. I haven't seen Joe in a while. Joe, I'm glad you're tuning in. I know you've been very busy between work and family, so I'm glad you're in the chat tonight, my friend. So welcome to sight. And of course, as always, there is the great Billy Ryan.
The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike the New Haven podcast.
Thank you to Bill, as always. My next guest was involved in law enforcement for about 31 years between both a civilian role, which he'll tell me a little bit about, and also involved in New York City's Special Office of Narcotics, where he was there from 1989 until his retirement in 2017. And he was involved not just in investigations, but behind the scenes, peer support and wellness programs, police recruitment, as well as labor advocacy. He's a former union president, so he knows firsthand how tricky that can be. There's a lot of pros and cons to a job like that. It's never easy. But he did for a long time, and he'll talk with me about that. And he knows and can go into the insights of not only his office, but the nature of investigations and how to coordinate those investigations, especially when you're working for a district attorney's office. So, and hello to Don Gonzalez, by the way, joining us tonight for this episode 346 is retired detective out of the Office of Special Narcotics, Mr. John Fleming. John, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Mike. Hello. Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
I appreciate you being here. So before we get into the office and, of course, your career in it, tell me a little bit about yourself, John. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the Bronx, Parkchester. It's the East Bronx. I lived there most of my life. I lived in the Bronx most of my life. When I got married, I moved to Yonkers. Then about 2017, when I retired, I moved down to Florida.
All righty. And early on, because your path, as we talked about off the air and as we'll talk about on the air tonight, your path into law enforcement was a unique one from the standpoint of the office you ended up in. But were you always interested in law enforcement or any kind of civil service early on, or was it something you kind of discovered you were interested in a little bit later, maybe in your teenage years?
Well, my whole family were cops, starting with my grandfather, 4 uncles, 5 cousins. My father worked for the New York City Transit Authority. He was a motorman, and it was ingrained in my head when I was a little kid, you got to get a pension, got to get a pension. So that's where I wound up.
So originally you worked for DOI. Now, for those of you that are from outside the New York City area, DOI is Department of Investigation, which is a kind of a law enforcement agency in and of itself, although its functions vary. You were civilian involved in that agency. Now, you can go into greater detail than I can. Explain to the audience DOI's function and what a civilian can do with that agency.
That's a good question. DOI was set up many, many years ago. When I got hired, there was a lot of corruption, municipal corruption going on. Ed Koch was the mayor. There were a lot of different scandals going on. Parking Violations Bureau was one of them. But when I got hired, they placed me in the DOI squad. And what was interesting about that was it was pretty much NYPD detectives. There was a police captain who was the commanding officer, and I was hired as a special investigator. So I took about a month worth of classes, learned how to do basic investigative work. And then I was assigned to that office, and I worked in investigation for 1 year, which wound up, we had the New York City sheriff arrested and indicted. I think it was the highest level case DOI ever did. It really turned me on into investigative work. I worked undercover. We did surveillance on this guy for about 7 months. I worked with a great detective. And it really was an eye opener. And that's what really made me go to the DA's office.
And when you look at the headlines these days in New York City, man, everything comes full circle, doesn't it? History repeats itself.
Yeah.
And for those of you that don't know what I'm talking about, just Google it and you'll understand. For those of you that may have a question in the chat as well for Detective Fleming, make sure you fire it away. And as always, at the appropriate time throughout tonight's episode, I'll be sure to highlight it. Now, you mentioned going through the police academy off the air when we were talking. Was the goal to lateral to the NYPD originally, or were you already involved in the Office of Special Narcotics?
What happened was after DOI, I got called to the Transit Police Academy. And back then, it was 2 different academies. I wanted to go to the NYPD, but Transit called me first. I was in the Transit Academy, and then I got a phone call from the chief investigator at the Special Narcotic Prosecutor's Office. The detective I worked with in DOI, Sal Palmieri, he had recommended me for the job. And when I was working in DOI, I had to go to the Manhattan DA's office a bunch of times because the case was sent over to the DA's office for prosecution. So they knew me from that. I went down for the interview. They said to me, when you come out of the police academy, we're going to hire you. So I had to go back to the Transit Academy. They didn't know what I was talking about. But the minute I got out of the Transit Police Academy, a month later, I was working for Special Narcotics. A very interesting way to get to the DA's office.
And I know this may seem silly in nature, but I do want to ask just so it gives me context for further questions, given the kind of work you guys are doing in investigations. You guys are fully sworn police officers. You guys are armed, I imagine.
Yes, everyone has to go to a police academy. About 75% of the investigators in the 5 DA's office and narcotics prosecutor were NYPD detectives. What happens is they retire on a Friday and they get hired by the DA's office, and they get to keep their pension, collect it, and they get a waiver. So they can get a pension and they can work. And that whole thing really is because they come to the DA's office with a specialized skill. The other 25% were people like me. We got hired with 2 years investigative experience. They send you to the police academy, and then you start work that way.
And you go into it as a detective, or is that a rank you gradually get like the police department as time goes on?
When I got hired, the title detective investigator was a county title. When I got hired, the county titles were removed from New York City government, and it was switched over to the city. So there was a test for detective investigator, and you got hired based on the county you went to. But when I got hired, they switched everything over to New York City. And when I got hired as a detective investigator. That was my rank. But I never worked as a patrolman. It was an unusual thing to get called a detective right away, but it really wasn't the same thing as getting promoted in the NYPD. You came on and you were a detective. And then there were 3 levels. So you could be a senior and you could be a supervisor.
Yeah. No, and and what's interesting with that is it's not, as you said, it's not like you would be patrolling because it's a specific function. It's a very specific office. They're after
Right.
narcotics, and that's the investigation. It's not like a New York City Police Department or at that time housing and transit
Right.
to where there's the patrol and then specialized units. With a smaller office like that, it makes sense. You're not going to hop in a sector car right away. And
Right.
given the mission at stake, especially during those days, why would you? So, and Joe Murray, I see your question. I'll highlight it in momentarily. I just want to ask this question first to you. 1989, 1990, when you got there, narcotics is out of control. And unfortunately, narcotics and homicide and really any violent crime, more times often than not, tend to go hand in hand. And this was during a time when the city had well over 2,000, almost 3,000 homicides a year. So it was the Wild West back then. Just tell me about your rookie year and being involved in what I imagine were street level narcotics investigations and some of the bigger stuff too, because the city was hurting.
Well, the special narcotic prosecutor had citywide jurisdiction, and the office was set up, I think, in 1972. There was a bunch of police scandals, and I think the governor of the city of New York back then, I think it was Hugh Carey, I'm not sure. But what he did was he tried to remove certain types of investigations from the police department and put them in the special narcotic prosecutor's office. At the time I was hired, 75% of the investigative staff was state troopers. They moved them out, and they slowly started to hire people like myself and retired detectives. The person who hired me was Sterling Johnson, and he was a retired New York City police sergeant. He's now a federal judge, but Sterling had the idea of getting his own investigators. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to focus on cases that involved multi-jurisdictional. So there was a point in time where I was assigned to a DEA task force. Then I was assigned to a Treasury, the El Dorado task force. So a lot of the investigations I did as I got more and more experience were more of a long-term type investigation. But the first year I worked there, I worked with a retired first grade detective, and he taught me everything he knew about detective work. I had informants. I had a very, very influential partner who really was like my mentor. He really helped me a lot.
And I was going to say, and hello to Scott Wagner. I see you in the chat as well. Especially back then, patience is key. If you're a young investigator, and this is any profession involving law enforcement, naturally, in a good way, you're all hopped up. You want to make a difference. You want to make an impact right away. But it's really that slow burn and that methodical build towards making sure you have an ironclad case. That way, making sure you can seek an ironclad indictment. You learn very early on, it's not so much, as the old saying goes, it's not so much a sprint, it's a marathon. You really have to pace yourself in these cases. And having a partner like that, you learn that pretty quick.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I did the first couple of years was just all surveillance. We would follow targets and a lot of the stuff that DA investigators do is they have to take the case to conviction. A police officer would go from the investigation to arrest. But with us, we worked with prosecutors and we had to help them prepare for the case. So if a case came in and it was an investigation internally, we would have the case from the beginning until prosecution. Then a lot of times there would be cases where you would have New York City police unit, narcotics come in. They would bring the case to the DA's office, and then we'd be responsible for preparing the case for prosecution. So a lot of times what would happen would be there would be a drug bust, and then we had to go find witnesses. We had to help the DAs. If you ever watch the show Law and Order, I tell people it's 100% false, okay? Totally false. A lot of the work that was done was by lawyers. Lawyers didn't do that type of work. They got ready to prosecute the case. They weren't out interviewing people.
You mean TV lies? No.
Yeah. It's Yeah, and I got into a heated fight with the guy who was the producer for that show.
Dick Wolf.
Yeah, and I remember him. They used to film it in my building, and I remember I went up to see him one day, and he said, "You're going to be very happy." He says, "We're going to be putting a TV show in where we're going to include DA investigators." And at the time, he told me it was going to be Jerry Orbach, and unfortunately, Jerry Orbach died. But I remember talking to him and just explaining, because he had no idea what a DA investigator was either.
So I'm a huge fan of Law and Order. I'm glad you mentioned that. And of course, Jerry Orbach's portrayal of Detective Lenny Briscoe, easily my favorite portrayal of any TV cop, and that includes Sipowicz. But it's funny because in the last episode, and this is how you know I'm a Law and Order connoisseur, it's the season finale of season 14. And Briscoe and Green are investigating a gun-related homicide where a wife set up a hit on her cheating husband. And as they're waiting for Scuba to retrieve the handgun out of the water, he tells his partner, Ed Green, portrayed by the great Jesse Martin, "Hey, I'm putting in my papers." And, Ed Green goes to Briscoe. "Well, what are you going to do?" He's like, "I'll pick up a case with the DA's office." So it's funny he would say that. And he didn't even know in real life what exactly the role was.
Yeah, it's interesting because they asked me, since they filmed on the 8th floor at 80 Center Street, they asked me if I wanted to, speak to somebody, but they told me they had a couple of people who were retired detectives who worked in the DA's office, and they worked in Manhattan. And they had some stuff down, but I told them, I said, from my point of view, if you want to know like what a career young guy does in the DA's office, I'd talk to you.
Yeah, no, it's sad because when Jerry took that role on, he was very sick with prostate cancer.
Yeah,
so he didn't have a lot of time left. He only did a couple episodes of Trial by Jury. That was the name of the show. He did a couple episodes, and unfortunately, he went back into the hospital. And he died in December of 2004 of that cancer at 69. The question Joe Murray had, he's a former NYPD cop turned criminal defense attorney. Does the MTA police fall under DOI?
No. DOI is, for the most part, the internal affairs for all mayoral agencies, with the exception of the New York City Police Department. So if you worked in DOI, you can investigate almost any city employee except for the New York City Police Department.
That makes sense. NYPD has its own internal affairs,
right.
So I can see why they would be exempt in that particular aspect. So in terms of, and you mentioned lawyers aren't going out there and doing it, so it's always funny to watch Jack McCoy and whoever his partner was go out there and do those interviews. You're doing them. And you have to get people to trust you, especially in narcotics cases. You're talking about situations where people naturally are afraid to open their mouth. They open their mouth, they could end up getting killed. Their loved ones could end up getting killed, especially if they're higher profile traffickers you're going after. So just tell me about gaining trust in order to build cases, which is sometimes the biggest hurdle of all.
Well, Mike, I can give you a great example of that. One time there was a very large narcotics gang that was working at a housing projects in Brooklyn. And we had the case, we picked it up from the police department. And what we found out was that the amount of territory these people had was tremendous. And we would go to the housing projects to try to get people to testify. And I remember going into apartments and the kids were doing their homework in the bathtub. And I remember asking my partner, I said, "Why are they in the bathtub?" And he said, "The parents don't want them getting shot." And at the time we were at a housing project in Flatbush, and there was a shootout across the street. And we didn't have radios to attach into the police department. Sometimes we got a citywide, but we had to call up, on our own. They came, but I used to feel bad to ask people to testify because I had a secondary concern. We did ask people to testify sometimes, and there's always that thought in the back of your mind: are you going to put the person in harm's way? But in the end, most people would not testify. They were too afraid.
You have to find alternate ways to build your case.
Yes.
You mentioned surveillance. That's a big part of it. Without giving tricks of the trade away as far as what you can discuss, what were some of the other ways to make sure, like we talked about earlier, when that indictment came down, it was ironclad and these jerks weren't getting out of it?
Wiretaps was a big thing. Search warrants were a huge thing. I mean, a lot of these guys, they were major drug dealers, but they were really stupid. And then when social media came, they love to go on social media and show their jewelry and stuff. But before social media, they would talk on the phone all the time. And a lot of times it was very easy to get a search warrant. So a lot of that was they gave themselves up.
That helps. Listen, it keeps you guys in business. This is called job security. So you always love to see that. I did want to ask this because this wasn't the case earlier on. The old school guys did not want it and did not favor it. But when Gotti had Castellano whacked, one of the reasons Castellano originally wanted to whack Gotti and his crew is because he found out they were dealing drugs. Now, once Gotti got Castellano out of the picture, that was something that the mafia became more brazen about getting into. In the early days, until, of course, they got brought down by the commission trials, was narcotics something you ended up investigating mobsters over?
Not really. Most of the cases I did, they labeled them. It was mostly Dominicans, Colombians. There were some Cubans, and a lot of it was street gangs. They had sources to bring drugs in. They would get them from places flown in. A lot of times people would come up from Baltimore, Pennsylvania, and they'd wind up getting killed. They try to sell drugs in certain areas. But I never really did a narcotics investigation with traditional organized crime. A lot of it was Dominicans, Colombians. That was really the most amount of people.
It's interesting you bring that up, and we're talking with Detective John Fleming. He's retired out of New York City's Office of Special Narcotics, a law enforcement agency that we're learning a lot about tonight. Producer Vick has a question in the chat. Was one of the gangs La Compañía?
There was a gang in Washington Heights like that. But, a lot of the times what they used me for was to go do surveillance. A lot of times I really didn't know much about the case. I would follow people on foot because a lot of times I didn't blend in certain areas like Washington Heights. So if we were working in certain boroughs like Queens or Staten Island, they would use me. But I had two partners who were Hispanic, and I had one guy who was Venezuelan, and he was an excellent undercover. He was amazing undercover. But for the most part, I would come in to do certain things. There were cases I had where I had to bring to trial, but a lot of the names I really don't even remember.
That blends in. Of course, you were there for almost 30 years. During the early stages, I think 89, really to 93, 94, we're still in the crack is whack era where the 80s was the worst of it, but we're still not out of the woods yet. And you worked in a lot of dangerous, gritty neighborhoods where it really ravaged and destroyed those neighborhoods. It took those neighborhoods forever to climb out of those holes. And it's not just New York City experiencing this. Really, a lot of the major cities across the country were going through it. LA is another one that comes to mind. So during that particular snapshot of your career, if you will, how many crack investigations and how much, all drugs are bad, obviously, but how much of an emphasis was put specifically on making sure you got those who were dealing that stuff off the street?
Well, I'll tell you, from what I could gather, my office cared more about money than drugs.
Makes sense.
There was a lot of asset forfeiture. That's why they put us in task force. And a lot of the cases I had, it wasn't street level, but it was more of we're not just going to arrest you, but we want to take all your money. And my office took in a lot of money through DEA and through the El Dorado task force. If we worked on the case and we were there, my office got money. And so for the most part, I never did a crack case in my life. Most of it was heroin or cocaine, powder cocaine.
The money trail is interesting because sometimes, with certain investigations at least, that can take you abroad because you got dealers coming in, not just from out of state. You mentioned the Dominicans, the Colombians, and even the Venezuelans too. They're coming from overseas. They'll make their buys or they'll make their sales and they'll try to hop on a plane back. And that's where the long-term patience comes in that we talked about earlier. So in regards to that, would you sometimes find yourself having to go overseas or having to send people overseas in order to keep track on these people? Or was it a waiting game where you were waiting for them to come back for the next drop and you could just get them then?
There were two cases that people in my office worked in where they went to Israel. That case I really didn't know much about. These were probably two of the most senior detectives. They went there. I did a lot of work in Miami, did some work there, and I also did work in Chicago. I would go there, do work, but I never went overseas or anything like that.
If you can discuss them, and if you can't, it's fine. We'll just move on. Miami, another narcotics hotbed, unfortunately. Well, you mentioned Cubans too. Cocaine is particularly popular down there. As far as the pipeline from Miami to New York, tell me about that or those types of investigations, I should say.
Well, I know that drugs were moved up on 95. One of the times I went to Miami was to interview someone who wanted to become an informant against his old group. He was facing a lot of jail time in Florida, and he said that he'd rather go to jail up in New York than go to jail down in Florida. And the DA's offices worked something out. He came up and he testified against everybody, and it was a major case. But a lot of the stuff was just going down there, getting information from from Miami-Dade detectives, and then just trying to follow it back up to see where the money was, where the drugs were winding up in New York. And certain people in Miami had certain crews that they worked with in New York, and you were able to define those pretty quickly because we did so much work with that.
Definitely interesting to see that. And again, it goes back to the conversations we had earlier about gaining people's trust and people who are in. I mean, I imagine it's, even though it's still tough, it's a little bit easier to gain someone's trust when they know the crap's hit the fan, and if they either it's this or it's a heavy jail sentence where they may never get out.
Right. Yeah. They a lot of these people were facing very long jail times, and then to try sometimes to get them to flip. Sometimes it was much easier getting them to do it than it was witnesses who were civilians.
Right. You know, especially people who are involved in the life, you can see that being the case. John Fleming's our guest tonight. Like I said earlier, for those of you just tuning in, he's a retired detective out of New York City's Office of Special Narcotics. I'm going to get to the union stuff because that's interesting. We'll touch on that. This will be a multi-layered conversation tonight. But I did want to ask you about, as well, once the city started to turn around, we saw the impact broken windows had on the NYPD. But there's other law enforcement agencies at the time that benefited. Certainly transit did. Bratton was there before. And certainly housing did too. Crime went down across the board. But there's also the other agencies outside of the big three, at least before the merger of 95, that benefited. You guys were already given a pretty good green light as it was to go after these people. But now there's even more incentive. Now there's even more of an emphasis. So 94, 95, 96, those first years of the Giuliani era, what was that like? Any impact at all in terms of more of an incentive, or was it business as usual?
Well, I can tell you right off the bat, the amount of support that the citizens gave the cops during Giuliani was much better than it was before I left. But again, my last 7 years, I did union work. So, I would get feedback from detectives who were doing work, but we didn't face the same amount of criticism that NYPD officers or, Port Authority, those guys are in it every day. With us, we were pretty much sheltered from that. When we did a case, no one knew who we were. We were very lucky that it was that. A lot of politicians I met when I was a union guy, they had no idea who we were.
And you were involved in that for a long time.
Yeah.
Before I touch on the union aspect, I wanted to touch a little bit about recruitment. We'll get back to your career and the trajectory of it as well. But recruitment is something that your office is a little bit different that way. But I know that's something we both wanted to touch on tonight. It's tough now. It wasn't easy then. The pay's not easy at first. It can get better as time goes on. But it's even in good times. Policing is a demanding job. It's a cool job, but it's a very demanding one. So from your vantage point, especially as someone who was involved in the union for such a long time, what's the good aspect of recruiting? What do you like about it? But what do you also feel can be better?
Well, I'll tell you this. I think any police union president in New York would share this that I have. It was very hard when Nassau, Suffolk, and up in Westchester, they're getting paid a lot more money than you. A lot of people I spoke to who came to New York, they came because they had family who were police officers. It was very difficult, I think, for police officers back when I was doing police work to stay in as a police officer when they found the existing Westchester, Suffolk, Rockland. They were making a lot more money. And that was a big issue. The other thing was when you did recruitment in the DA's office, they would hire you sometimes because of who you know, but you had to have a lot of extensive investigative experience. So they would hire people. For example, I had a good friend who was a police officer in the Middle East. His name was Fred. He was from Jordan. When he came to the United States, he had a background in military intelligence, and he got hired by the Manhattan DA's office. And in the 1990s, he was working cases with the federal government, and he had a background like that, and he was very, very successful in helping them with that. Also, there was a detective in Queens who had a law background, and he was doing cases that were mostly fraud cases. So some of the people who came on had very unusual backgrounds and very unique. And usually the detectives who came on from the police department, they had a very strong background. I mean, the DAs would pick and hire people. So they would call up a detective and say, I want to hire you. And that became a point of contention for Ray Kelly, because someone would make grade, like second grade, and a month later they'd be gone. And I know from talking to people in the DEA, they weren't too happy with that. So a guy would make grades, and then a month later he's retiring and he goes to the DA's office, and because he's a second grade detective or first grade, he gets hired at more money.
And that's a tricky road to navigate. And there was two hurdles that they had with that. One was, I didn't know that was one of them. You just highlighted that. The other one was guys would leave. They would do the rollover, which for those of you, most of you in the chat know, you can carry your pension over to another city agency. They'd go to the fire department. And let's say they were a cop for 10 years.
Yes.
They go to the fire department. They keep the top pay they had in the PD when they started the FD. Ray Kelly put a stop to that. So many rollers from happening.
Yeah. So, he didn't like the DA's offices. I know a lot of times he lost people. I know a detective who was a homicide detective in the Bronx. And when he made first grade, the Bronx DA hired him like a month later. And I'm sure that the NYPD was not happy with that.
Well, you know what? Let's talk about that for a second, because this has been a problem. It's not just recently. It's been going on for a long time now, where somebody drives a chief around and they get a gold shield, and they're not really out there doing detective work, or they weren't out there hustling as a police officer. If you did your time on the street for 20 years and you were a cop's cop and now you're driving a chief, hey, all right, no problem, cool with that. But if you're a 2-year, 3-year guy or girl and you're doing that and you get a shield, that's a slap in the face to the guy or girl that's out there for a long time, busting their hump, making a lot of arrests, to where I guess the point is, by the time they do get grade, it's too late. It's been so long now. They've been passed over so many times where by the time they actually do get it, they're already in line for a pension.
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate. A lot of my family members, of all 9 of them, none of them became detectives. They all would take a test, they'd get promoted, but none of them wanted to be detectives. There's nobody in my family that was a detective. I had sergeants, had some lieutenants, and a captain, but they never understood what I did for a living. They couldn't understand how I left the police academy and all of a sudden I'm a detective, and they had no idea what the special narcotic prosecutor's office is. So for a long time, no one in my family had any idea what I did for a living.
And listen, we love our white shields. Joe Murray, you were a white shield. That's nothing against our white shields. If you want to be a white shield your whole career, I've said this before, and you have no desire to go anywhere else, that's cool. You can do a lot as a white shield and have a lot of fun. But there are some people like, Billy Ryan, of course, you were a detective, Scotty Wagner, so were you. If the gold shield is something that you want, it should be attainable from the standpoint that, okay, it's the only rank in the NYPD that there's no exam for. Other departments around the country have a different process. The NYPD, it's given to you. You truly earn it in most cases. There are some cases, however, where it's not earned. And I think that not only hurts recruitment, because a recruit has this in mind for down the road, retention too, John. Retention suffers as well.
Yeah. A lot of times when I was a union president, I would have somebody who came on as a DA investigator like myself, and then they would hire like a first grade detective and he'd be making double the salary. And I tried telling them, well, this guy got hired because he's worked 20 years, and he's got that experience. You don't have that. But that was a major point of contention for the union, because some guy would come on and he'd have a background, a very strong background. So he'd get hired about $20,000 more than what a guy who'd been there 5 or 6 years made. And I understood that, well, you know what, that guy's coming on because he's had a whole career. He's got that experience. You know, I would tell the guy who was the younger guy, well, you know what, if you're going to take the experience and just take money, go work in the feds, because a lot of guys would leave the DA's office and go work with the FBI, DEA, or they'd work with the Secret Service. I mean, most of the people who I knew who left, they went into the federal government. They became an agent.
Yeah, and that's usually, it's a good stepping stone. It gives you valuable experience. If you want to stay in the office, hey, you had a lot of fun. You did it for a long time. As we're talking about tonight, you know, that's cool too. But if you want to make that leap, and certainly some people have those ambitions, you see people do it from the police department as well. Pete Forcelli is a friend of mine. He's been on this program before. He was a detective in the NYPD, was a cop in housing. And the summer of 2001, a few months before 9/11, he ended up heading on over to the ATF, where he stayed for the remainder of his career. So it's definitely not uncommon. Scott Wagner, a former guest of this show and a frequent collaborator off the air with myself, says the NYPD Detective Shield is the most recognized shield in all of law enforcement. And this is true. Very valuable shield, an important shield to wear. Good to see you, my friend. Hope you're feeling better. Back to your career, the timeline of it. 1998, 1999, 2000. Now you get a little bit more time on. I always like asking this question to my PD and FD guests, because here you are now in a position where you were the brand spanking new rookie in 89 walking in, had a lot to learn, but you blink and now you're the guy that, you're not the oldest guy in the office, but you have enough time on to where these younger guys, you can mentor, you can give back a little bit the same way guys gave to you in 89 and 90 when you were first starting out. So tell me about teaching these younger guys and some of the guys that you were able to take under your wing that really took off and gave you that proud papa feeling.
Well, yeah, a couple of younger guys came on with Special Narcotics. When you hit the late 90s, they hired a lot of retired detectives. They hired a lot less career, as they would call them, investigators, and they hired a lot more people who were retired DEA agents. But 1 or 2 times, investigator would come on out of the police academy, and they would tell you, okay, you know what, you're going to be with them for about a year. You're going to teach them what the other guys taught you. So it was very interesting to help people to build up the experiences they had. And working in an office like a DA's office, you get introduced to a lot of different types of cases. A lot of what you do is working with prosecutors, so you get to understand a case a little bit differently. And the DA's offices, the investigators, they would want you to work a certain way with a prosecutor. So really, my boss a lot of times was an ADA. You know, they would tell you, okay, you're going to do it this way. And that's how I learned really to do investigations. Not only with the guy who I sat with was a detective, I would work a lot with attorneys. And that's how I would train the other guys. I'd tell, okay, you know, the mindset is a little bit different. The lawyers want you to look at it a different way, and you're going to have to get used to that because you work in a law firm, really. That's why I always looked at it. I tell people I worked in a law firm. The DAs, the ADAs pretty much controlled everything once the case was brought to them.
And you can correct me if my perspective is faulty in this, but I feel like with detectives, not to say detectives don't care about detail, they certainly do. And that's something that I've learned with the many that I've had the good fortune to talk to, both on the air with this program over the years and off of it. But there's more of a bing, bang, boom factor where, okay, you're dealing in the just the facts man mentality. Here's what happened. Here's the suspect that did it. And here's the reasons as to why we believe they committed this crime. I feel like with the DA's office, and you can, again, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a little bit more intricate. You know, there's a lot more involved in terms of explaining not only each step, but maybe additional factors that maybe a detective, not out of negligence, wouldn't consider because, again, you have to keep a straight line in investigation. Whereas maybe there's a bit more of a gray zone in the DA's office.
Well, I heard the term, you don't have enough yet, more than anything. So we go back and say, okay, we think we're going to make an arrest. And the prosecutor would say, no, get more. So they cared more about what you brought to the courtroom as opposed to what a detective would bring to the DA's office. So they would make sure every T was crossed, every I was dotted. And after a while, it became a little frustrating because you thought you had everything. But again, the lawyer looks at it differently. So they may want more. And a lot of times it resulted in arguments because we'd say, no, you got enough. But they'd say, I'm prosecuting the case. You got to give me more. And that became a problem sometimes. But especially for guys who came from the police department, they had to get to understand that mindset. But that was a big issue. Nope, I don't have enough. Keep getting more, keep getting more.
I think the concern, I can understand it from their perspective, and I can understand both sides of the coin, but maybe is all it takes is one competent defense attorney to undo it. You get it, like, for example, a Bill Kunstler in the court's room. That's a bit of a different story. He was a very high-profile attorney, but someone in that vein that can see the little opening and boom, like a needle, just undo everything and, make you guys look like amateurs, which you're certainly not.
Right. And a lot of these drug dealers could afford really good attorneys.
Mm-hmm.
So, after a while, I understood what they were saying, because a lot of times you testify and they would tell you, you better be ready. And, there were times I would testify and, it was like the guy knew everything I was going to say before I said it. I would always have notes with me, because a lot of the prosecutors knew who the lawyers were. And a lot of times they would tell you, look, you're going up against this attorney, this guy's going to be sharp. You better have everything down. And a lot of times they wanted to make sure you had that extra piece of evidence because they knew that would have to be brought in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, one thing, well, actually, I'll highlight this question before I get to the next aspect of what I was going to ask you. Joe Murray, again, former New York City police officer, now a criminal defense attorney. Do you remember an ADA, Bill Viskovich from Special Narcotics in the 90s? Great guy, loves cops. He's now a judge in Queens.
I don't think so. The way the prosecutors, the ADAs, were brought on, they came from all 5 DA's offices. So the 5 prosecutors had to give the DA's office legal staff, and they'd come and they would go. The detectives were hired by the DA, and the support staff was, but the ADAs, they all came from different offices, and that was the deal that they had when they set the office up. So a lot of times people would come and go. The trial attorneys I knew very well, but a lot of times you'd have ADAs working in different bureaus. For example, there was a whole unit that investigated doctors, and you'd have prosecutors for that. You had people who would do the drug court. People would get arrested first-time felons, and they'd go to what's called DTAP, and that was a drug treatment program, and you had a lot of prosecutors who did that. So the office had a lot of different areas that were, some were more drug investigative, some were more regulatory.
And it's, of course, around 99, 2000, the city's in a good spot narcotics wise, but there's, in crime wise in general, a lot of the crime that you had seen in the first time that you would come on the job in 89, 90, that first decade, you saw the pendulum really swing from one end to the other. And it was a good evolution. It was an interesting evolution, both personally and professionally. So we know it was heroin and cocaine in the early years. 2000 heading into 2001, again, pre 9/11, when the focus shifted a little bit. Was that still the problem for you guys? Was that still the main goal, or had it shifted to another form of narcotics?
Well, I know OxyContin became a big thing, especially when they set up a unit to investigate doctors. But by that time, I was in a federal task force called El Dorado, and El Dorado was the IRS. It was all Treasury. It was IRS, Secret Service, and they cared more about money. So that part of my career was all money laundering, and wasn't drugs. It was just money laundering. That's all I did. If I made an arrest, my office got a part of the money. And every arrest I made, there was hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they would divvy it up between the offices that were involved. So the feds got their part, but then each agency, whether it was state or local, they would get a piece of the pie.
So tell me about that, because El Dorado is something I've heard a lot about. Did a lot of great work during that time frame. Being involved in that, talk about hot and heavy. Tell me about how that opportunity came to be and the notable cases, if you can discuss them, that stand out.
Well, I worked for a year with inspectors from customs. And what we would do is we would target flights that were leaving the country going to what they called source countries, Nigeria, Peru, things like that, where people would be bringing drugs money back to where they came from. And when you leave the country, you got to declare what you have as far as finances. And if you have $10,000, or more, you got to declare it. And a lot of times people wouldn't declare it. So you would check them. They fit a profile. And so if you check them and they had money, then you could take the money. And one day my boss called me and said, we're going to put you in this task force with customs. But the building was at 5 World Trade. And they worked out of there, and I got assigned. And when I went there, they put me with a group that was run by the IRS. And they told us, okay, you're going to be cross-designated. You're going to work with IRS and Secret Service. And every case I did was more about how much money can you get. So I never really saw any type of drug investigation in the task force.
And it's interesting because at this time, it's worth noting Customs is not merged yet with Border Patrol. They've since merged. Right. That happened in 2003. When you were in that task force, Customs was by itself. So they had right. a bit of a different focus back then. Yeah. And their focus has since changed. So it's amazing that you mentioned that because, again, we talk about the money trail. Money is, in a lot of these crimes, really the root of all evil. You see it in financial type crimes in the white collar world. You see it in the more violent crimes. The common thread in all these is money. And it's amazing sometimes even businesses or people that may present themselves as legitimate that you would never think would be involved in these type of things. And it had to be an eye opener, even for a seasoned investigator like you.
I never saw that much money in my life. An example would be you'd stop a livery driver and he'd have in his trunk duffel bags and, it'd be full of money and, they'd say, it's not my money. But a lot of times we just take the money. There were also informants, but they made a lot of money in that. And my office made a lot of money. And that's why I stood there. And I could work as much overtime as possible. They paid for it, so I didn't care.
Right. Go out there and get the job done. And hey, secure, pad that pension if you can as well, which you certainly did during that time. And that work was definitely appreciated. 9/11 happens, and the shift from narcotics or common crimes into more of a counterterrorism, I should say, environment does occur. Now, that wasn't the Office of Special Narcotics case, but sometimes you mentioned overseas drug dealers, sometimes those who are trafficking narcotics. It's not uncommon to read stories where they're also linked to terrorism as well. Was that an angle your office explored at times a little bit post 9/11 or not really? It was more just kind of status quo.
Well, I mentioned the Israel case. Yeah. I know they did work in Germany, but those detectives who worked those cases were probably the most seasoned detectives. So by around 2001, I was getting ready to do the union stuff. I had got elected in 2002, and I started in 2003. So in that time period, I was getting ready to be the union president.
Now, that's a segue into what we want to talk about with the union. Now we can get into the meat and potatoes of it, where, again, not an easy job. Even if it's a smaller agency, a lot of responsibility because you're looking out for everybody. And that involves a lot of haggling, both one-on-one and collectively as a group. And you want to make sure everybody's satisfied. Some people are going to be satisfied. There's some people that no matter what you do and you could bend over backwards, they're going to have a gripe about something. So what made you want to do that? And early on, what were the biggest challenges and successes that you noted?
Well, I wanted to do it because some friends I knew and coworkers were getting really sick from 9/11. And back then, there was nothing that you could do for them. And we used to tell the offices, the DA's offices to spend money to send the people to get treatment. And I remember 3 or 4 my friends died. The guy from Israel I told you about, the Middle East, he died very quickly. So I was really concerned about that. Plus the DA's offices were not too investigative friendly back then. So when I ran for the union president, I got elected, our union was unusual. We were like a local of the DEA, the Detectives Endowment Association. So they would handle most of our benefits. We could use them as far as attorneys and stuff. So once I became the union president, it was really hard to understand about collective bargaining. I had no background in that. But I hired a very good lawyer. And like I mentioned to you, I had 2 very good mentors. Floyd Holloway, who was very well known. He was the chief lobbyist up in Albany, and he was the lobbyist for something called the New York State Association of PBAs. And there's a lobby group up in Albany. I don't know if it's still there, but it was made up of about 17 police unions from all over the state police too. All the police unions in New York City were there, and we were in there. And we would lobby up there for benefits. So Floyd was a big help to me, and Jimmy Boyle. Jimmy Boyle at the time was the labor relations director for Joe Hines in Brooklyn. And I met him. He replaced someone named Bill McKechnie. And McKechnie had worked in transit, but Jimmy really helped me understand a lot of the ins and outs.
Now, we talked about Jimmy last episode with Chief Swithers. We'll get into him now as well. He died 5 years ago, but he left his impact on the FDNY, and what he went through with losing his son on 9/11 is something you wouldn't wish on any parent. Very smart guy, very savvy guy, not just in terms of operations and the firefighting side, but the union side as well. When you look back at him, not only as a union official and learning from him on a professional level, but also your friendship with him, what are your favorite memories of him, and how would you define him, both as a union official and as a person?
Well, I know when I first went to Albany, there was the big thing. There was a senator named Guy Villela, and he was from the Bronx. And the Manhattan DA's office did an investigation on him, and the Manhattan DA was all over him for a number of years. And when we went to Albany, we had to go through Guy Villela, and he hated the DA's offices, so he wouldn't even talk to me. And Floyd took me to his office one day, and he helped me get some traction on a bill. And I remember him telling Floyd, he said, I wouldn't do this for anyone other than you. And then Floyd tried to explain to me how you got to make relations with the politics, with the politicians. He was very knowledgeable about how to speak to them. And then Jimmy Boyle in New York, he explained to me how you deal with the city council. So back when I was the union president, the city council and police unions didn't have a great relationship, but they didn't look at us the same way. So they looked at us more like employees with the DA's offices. So a lot of times I was able to get some help that way. And Jimmy Boyle was very helpful, as was Lou Matarazzo, who was the lobbyist for the DEA. And he was also the union president for the PBA. But, those three guys who had all that experience, and Floyd Holloway and Jimmy Boyle pretty much gave me my labor attorney. His name was Harry Greenberg, and he was the attorney for the Nassau County PBA. And he also was a retired police detective, but he was an excellent lawyer. When we negotiated, we had the 5 DA's offices represented, plus we had the director of labor relations. So it was really a ridiculous way to negotiate. And the DA's offices were not really supportive of a lot of the things we wanted. Harry Greenberg was able to get us in the right places. We never had PERB. The police, the NYPD police unions try to get PERB. The PBA did get it, but we got PERB very early on, and we were able to negotiate like a county agency. So we could ask for things that the PBA couldn't, but it was all because of Floyd Holloway and Harry Greenberg that really pushed the way for us.
It could be stressful because it is essentially a 24/7 job, as anybody that's ever done it can tell you. It doesn't matter how big or small the union is. Where I work, I'm not a firefighter there, but I'm a civilian employee for a fire department here in Connecticut. And one of the captains I answer to, he does that. And, I see sometimes he's got a lot of work on his hands in addition to being a shift commander. So it's work no matter what. Tell me about balancing, handling everything, but knowing when to take a step back for the sake of your own mental health and decompressing. How did you manage that?
Well, there were 2 things that really got to me. One was contract negotiations. And I remember they would tell me, don't take it personally. This is just how negotiations are. The other was when someone would get, they'd have psychological problems. A lot of it was from 9/11, but that's how the wellness program came into effect. We never had anything like that. And at the time, Mount Sinai, and they still do today, they have a medical monitoring program for 9/11 workers. and I had gone up to one of the guys who was involved in the 9/11 program, and I asked him, would you be open to setting up some sort of wellness program with the detectives and the DA's offices? And after about 6 months, we actually had something on the books. I then went to someone in the DEA who helped me get a woman who came in, and they trained about 12 detectives to be peer support officers. So you could call up a detective, and if you were going through a really hard time, they would do it. They'd come talk to you. There was no, there was no pressing. There was no questions about what it was. You would just talk to the person, and peer support is a really important thing. I've always advocated it for it. To me, it's much easier talking to someone who's who's also a cop. But we had a very successful peer support program. And then we had with the 9/11 with Mount Sinai, we had a really good program. So the city health coverage, they decided they would accept everything that Mount Sinai offered because it was all really preventive. So if once a year you can go to a doctor in this program, you can go to a dietitian, you can go psychologist, and you could get all these benefits, and it really mirrored a lot of what the 9/11 program was.
I'll talk more about wellness momentarily, but just since you mentioned it, I know you guys were helping out in the aftermath, as everyone was, but that day, it doesn't matter where you were from. If you were any kind of first responder, which you guys certainly were, it was all hands on deck. Did you and other members of your agency get down there that day, or was it more in the days afterward?
There was about 18 detectives from Manhattan and Special Narcotics and Brooklyn that were there. But later on, they went to go work on what they called the pile. And a lot of the detectives who got sick and died, they all worked there. And a lot of them got sick very quickly. I actually wasn't even in the state when that happened. I was working down in Miami on a case. So I didn't get home for 9 days because we were going to bring that guy back with us, the guy I told you wanted to flip.
Right.
And we went Monday morning, the 10th. And when we got there, we had to meet with the detectives from Miami. And that next morning was September 11th. And we were interviewing the guy, and he actually gave us all the information we needed. During the interview, the warden came in and told us we had to go speak to him. He showed us the TV. So, I mean, I had no idea what was going on. The interview was going on from 6:30 in the morning until 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. But once the second plane hit, they came in and told us, you got to leave. You got to come call your office. The next day, we went to go bring the guy back in the airport. Everything closed down. So we had this guy for 9 days. And we would bring the guy back to the prison. Well, we'd go to the airport, and finally they told us, look, it's going to be a number of days. You just got to wait. And that's what we did. We just waited. So I missed all of that.
Was there anybody on the NYPD side or any sort of police agency, Port Authority police, that you knew who perished that day?
I had a friend who was a fire marshal. His name was Buka.
Ronnie Buka, yep.
Yeah, and he was very good friends with a friend of mine. They were friends for a very long time. I knew him, and when I got back, I was told that he had died, and two other friends that I had died. But most of them who died later on from the 9/11 illness.
Right. Yeah, Ronnie Buka, for those, most of you in the chat know this, but for those of you that are from outside the New York City area, fire marshals are equivalent to police officers in New York City.
Right.
They're armed. They have full police powers. They can arrest you. They carry guns as well. So Ronnie was not only responding as a firefighter that day, he was also responding as a police officer in a sense. He got all the way up to the 78th floor of the South Tower with Chief Oriole Palmer. He ran marathons, and he was a military man, so he was in great condition. And they were the only ones to get that far before the collapse happened.
He was a great guy. Really, him and his wife, they were great people to be with. Very funny, and it was really easy being with him because you love to talk with him. So, he was a great guy.
Yeah, and you know what? He had a lot of guts, goes without saying, because he had a horrible injury. He had a bad fall. They called him the flying fireman because he fell multiple stories, caught himself on the way down, but was still badly hurt. He'd been, I think, in Rescue 1 at the time in Manhattan, and fought his way back to the job. You know, it
Mhm.
went through a lot physically to get
Yeah.
back, but definitely a man of resilience. And that day he acted very, very heroically. You mentioned wellness. It's important now, and we talk about it a lot on the podcast between our PD and FD guests. Let's face it, you're seeing terrible things. You're seeing the worst in humanity, and you're seeing people at their worst. It weighs you down. And I think it's timely. We just had an NYPD detective out of the 105 squad in Queens commit suicide a few days ago, left behind a wife and two young daughters. And you say to yourself in your head, why? But then again, we're thinking rationally. It's easy for us to say that from our
Right.
standpoint because we're in the right state of mind. Eventually, seeing these things breaks you down to where you're not in a right state of mind. And you talked about establishing that wellness program. I think
Yeah.
it's ahead of the curve because, again, you want to help these guys and gals before it's too late. So tell me about the emphasis of that and the success stories. You don't have to name names, but the success stories of people that were really jammed up mentally, as we all can get sometimes. But that program really did wonders to help them get out of that rut.
Yeah, we had in Queens and we had in Brooklyn 2 detectives committed suicide in the office.
Oh, good.
And you know, the detectives who work in the DA's office, the average age was like 53. So when I went to Mount Sinai, I told them, I said, you know, if you were to come up with a program for people this age, you could probably market this to, you know, Wall Street, stuff like that. I said, you know, the people you're going to be seeing really abused themselves for a number of years. We had a lot of guys who were overweight, blood pressure was high, and a lot of them had, you know, some psychological issues which built up throughout their career. So when I spoke to Mount Sinai, they put me in touch with the administrator who started the original program, and a doctor who was involved, and we spent about 6 months working on it. And then I had to get the 5 DAs to go along with it. The city of New York went along with it right away. So did GHI. But I'll tell you, some of the DAs were dead set against it, and that infuriated me. I mean, we had to get the DAs. The city told us you got to get the DAs to approve this, and I tell you, some of them were. I don't want to use the words because it's you know. I tell you, they were dead set against it, and then finally we embarrassed them going to the news. I went to the Daily News, and I went to the New York Post, and I embarrassed two of them, and they deserve to be embarrassed.
Absolutely.
But in the end, they all came on, and they all supported it.
And it's like, why would you not? Like, you know, is it, and these are people's lives we're talking about. So, and there's no other way to put it. These are people's lives. Why do you want them to go home, put a gun to their head, and end it all? Because then what are you going to say afterwards? Oh, we'll miss him. We loved them. You could have helped him while he was alive. So it's just like, you know, anybody that's against something like that, I'm like, hello, or earth to whoever you are, especially now in today's day and age. I
Right.
don't get it. I
Yeah.
don't get it. But good on you for doing that, because I'm like, you know, you can't mess around. Listen, health in general, physical or mental, you can't mess around with. But I think people learn it now, especially when it comes to mental health. You really can't mess around with that. It's just as important as any physical ailment one may have.
Right. Yeah. A big thing. And also, there was a something called critical incident stress
Yes.
debriefing, and the woman who did the training, her name was Cindy Goss, and she brought someone from Texas, and he had done a lot of work with the federal government. His name was Grady Bray, and he had actually done a lot of work with Bill Clinton's staff during the Monica Lewinsky thing. I mean, but he had a very, very unique background. Cindy Goss had done a lot of work in Buffalo, and also Paul DiGiacomo, who at the time was a board officer with the DEA. He was very helpful. So you had all these people helping me put something together. And then there was somebody from the NYPD. I forgot his name, but he did pop-up. I forgot his name.
I know what you're
I
talking
think
about. I forget his name as well.
so. Yeah, so he helped. So we put all this stuff together on our own, and you know, when they trained the peer support officers, we had these people who were professionals actually monitor them, and they'd come back and they'd say, you know what, this guy's good, this guy isn't. They did a lot of personality evaluation, and they would say, you know, certain types of brains are more have more empathy than others. And you need to have empathy, and you need to understand, about communication. So when they did all this work with them, they'd come back and they'd say, a lot of your guys are very, very, knowledgeable. They're very good with communication. And they said, maybe it's because they're detectives, but we got 12 people right away. 3 of them were women. We made sure that we had women. And then we had one person who was Muslim. At the time, they were starting to hire people. So then we would try to have people who were, different backgrounds. And we also had our own chaplains. We went to the NYPD, and they gave us access to them.
Good job well done in that aspect. Again, wellness is wellness, and it doesn't matter what one may be going through. The point is, it's got to be handled. It's got to be dealt with in a way that helps that person. And I think that's something that, again, as I've covered before in this program, there's a lot of societal evolutions that are not positive these days. That is one that is, I'll make an exception for, that is a positive. There's more of an emphasis now on the importance of mental health than there was then, because 20, 30, 40 years ago, heck, even 10, 15 years ago, the mentality was, no, suck it up. What are you, what are you, a sissy? Yeah, no, that's not the way.
Yeah, and that was a big thing in the beginning, trying to get people to, buy into this. They were like, I'm not doing that. And, after a while, people would talk to other people and say, you know what, I went through this, and this is, this is pretty good. And then you get people that way. And we try to get people, detectives who had a really good reputation, so that, if you went to so-and-so, maybe you didn't trust them. But if you went to someone who was a peer support officer, I could guarantee you he's someone with an excellent reputation, the cop's cop type thing. Yeah. And, there would be people in a squad room who, if you wanted to talk to, who you trusted, you'd go to this guy. Well, a lot of times that was our peer support officer for that office.
Nice. And again, another good way to go about it. There's no shame in it. There's no shame in it. It doesn't, and I think that's an unfortunate thing that a lot of guys don't realize. And unfortunately, they don't think about it until it's too late. And unfortunately, we've lost them, where no, it doesn't make you weak. It's the opposite. It actually makes you look really strong. It's strong to admit that, hey, I'm not doing good. I need some help, man. I can't go about this alone. It takes a strong person to do that. It's the opposite of weak. But I think until that stigma gets broken through, it's tough, because you got guys and gals of a bygone era. They were brought up with a much different mentality that they have trouble believing. No, it's okay. We want you to talk about this. This is a good thing that you talk about this. We'd rather you open up about it than not. But a program like that goes a long way in helping that. So again, thank you for diving into that. Moving ahead to 2017, a long time in that office, almost 30 years, different roles, investigator for a long time, union guy for a long time. You wore different hats, but you had a successful run. And then comes the point in time where you said, all right, you know what, I'm going to retire. I always like asking this to guys too. Series of moments or one particular moment that made you say, all right, you know what, I've had my fun, time to go.
I grew tired in New York. In 2017, I moved to Florida. All my family members who were cops retired on St. Patrick's Day. So I retired St. Patrick's Day, 2017. 4 months later, I was building a house in Florida. And a year later, I moved down there full time.
Must be nice as I sit to you from New Haven, Connecticut, where it's 28 degrees outside and freezing, and you're in the nice Florida sun. I'm not mad. Don't worry. I'm not mad.
Well, you got to be in Florida in the summer when there's hurricanes. I've been down here for 4 hurricanes, so it's not something I'm used to in New York, but that's the bad part, hurricanes.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Florida just went through it. And
yes.
Shout out to everyone who went through Helene, and hopefully you guys are doing okay and recovering well from that. When you look back at your career, again, I'm very glad you came on, because as I mentioned in the promo, this is an agency not a lot of people, unless you're really familiar and did the work and cross paths with them, know about. And I certainly didn't know a lot about the office until we talked via LinkedIn. So this was a really good show. When you look back on your career, what are you proudest of? Because you accomplished a lot.
Well, I'd say that the peer support stuff. I did some work with the police unions and the first responder unions to get Governor Pataki to sign that original bill where if you retired with an ordinary pension and you got sick years later, we had explained to the governor that it shouldn't be. You should be able to go back and change that and make it a disability. And actually, he was very supportive. Rudy Giuliani was not, but I could tell you George Pataki he had the door open. The Public Employees Conference and the New York State Association of PBAs pushed it very strongly. They wanted all the unions to, really push their elected officials. So when Governor Pataki signed that, that was a big thing, because no one knew back then how many people would die from 9/11 years later. And as long as you registered when you retired, you can go back and you could change your pension. So I had a lot of detectives, a lot of friends who 3, 4, 5, 6 years later came down with cancer. And then you would go, and if you signed the paperwork when you left, you could go back and change your pension. And that's for really any city employee who was involved in 9/11.
Yeah, and it's a day that's still killing. We're still losing people.
Yeah.
We're still losing people. And it's been 23 years. That's the sad part. We're going to keep losing people.
Yep.
True. But again, thanks for doing that. Really good question from Christian Williams in the chat, and we're going to highlight it. He says, sorry that it's late. It's fine, Christian. No worries. But did the DAs, and he mentions Giuliani as well in a follow-up question, did the DAs and Giuliani who were against the wellness program ever say why they were against it?
Well, Giuliani was against using city money for 9/11 workers who were sick. And I remember at the time he said something like, go to the feds, that's not my problem. But if anyone would remember, about 6 or 7 months later, one of his deputy mayors, Rudy Washington, got sick. And he came all out to get him workers' compensation benefits. And that, personally, for me, was the last day I respected Rudy Giuliani. I hate the guy today. I don't care what he did for the city. In my mind, he turned his back on the first responders. He made a career of Mr. Mass, whatever they called him. But I'll tell you, my opinion, he did nothing for us. As far as the DAs, with why they didn't support the wellness program, one told me that he didn't trust someone going to a peer support officer who was also a DA investigator and him telling him things. And at the time, we had to find out, do you have any protections if someone comes to you and says, hey, I did this and this? Is it like a priest? And at the time, that was a big issue. So the DAs were very, very, they were very secretive about what went on in their offices. And I don't think they wanted certain things to come out. They're all politicians. But the other thing was they didn't want their own people to be going to doctors to have some sort of psychological or medical problem that they didn't know about. So that was, and again, that was the first few months. But I did get people in the police department who were very pro wellness to speak to their chiefs, their executive ADAs, and in the end, they all bought into it. The first person to buy in was Judge Brown. He was the first person to come on board. He supported it a bunch, and he really got some of the other DAs to go along with it. So I appreciated what he did back then.
I don't agree with their philosophy, but I can understand where they were coming from to an extent, if that makes any sense, because as Joe Murray mentions in the chat, no doctor-patient privilege or attorney-client privilege, and subpoenas can be involved in that too. So it kind of gives context as to why they were. I can see why they were originally.
They're all lawyers, so it's an example of them thinking like lawyers. And again, in the end, it all worked out.
Yeah, I'm glad it did. All right, that puts context to that. This brings us to the rapid fire. This was a really fun conversation. And now it's time for the 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You can say pass if you want. And you kind of talked about it early on. Some of these questions you may have answered already, but we'll go into some of them. And there's a lot of rewards to peer support. What would you say was the most rewarding part of volunteering for peer support and being a part of that?
Hearing someone tell you that you saved my career. By far, you would hear people say, come back and give you feedback. And they'd say, you know what, turn my life around. I can still keep working.
Awesome. How do you feel law enforcement can improve recruitment efforts today?
Well, I look at it this way. Cops are never more under the microscope than they are now. Yet at the same time, they keep lowering standards. So it makes no sense. Now they bring people on who might not be as qualified as they should be, yet they expect more from those people. And I don't think that that's fair. I think if you're going to expect a certain amount of qualifications, a certain amount of knowledge, then you should be hiring the best possible people, not using anything else other than their qualifications, skills. That should be it.
Merit matters. Best advice anyone ever gave you about life or the job?
Very easily. I was told something by my partner. He says, write this down. You're never going to forget it. No good deed goes unpunished.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, that's what he told me very early on. And he says, write that down. He said, don't ever forget that.
Absolutely. Fourth, and this is a question I definitely like asking to some. Of all the eras of your career encompassed into those 28 years, if there's a certain time period in your career you can go back to that was really the sweet spot of your career, if you go back to work tomorrow in a time machine, what part of your career, what era are you going back
to? Well, the beginning of being a union president, that was the lowest time because I didn't know what I was doing. If it wasn't for people like the Detectives Endowment Association who helped me try to understand it, Floyd Holloway, Jimmy Boyle. So those were the roughest 3 or 4 years that I had with regard to the police work. I always loved it. That was something that was I loved.
That's a snapshot there about the first 12, 13 years then, if we're going back in time.
Yeah, I'd say the most amount of fun I had was like 1996 to 1998. And then the low point was 2003, 2004, because a lot of it was friends getting sick. There's no options for them. And then you had people who had a lot of psychological issues. And at the time, we didn't have anything to help them.
I'm glad you came out of it, and a lot of great work was done. So a lot of challenges early on, but a lot of great work came out of that. And the fifth and final question, advice you'd give to a newly promoted investigator. You were a detective investigator for a long time. You know a lot about investigations. A new sleuth, what advice are you giving them?
I don't know how the DA's offices operate today. I would never want to work in the Manhattan DA's office. Mm-hmm. I don't even know what they do today. So I would tell someone, if you want to be a DA investigator, go work for the Drug Enforcement Administration. Go work for a DA's. You could be a DA's office in any county in the state. Go to Long Island. Go to Westchester. Don't go to New York City. Don't.
Yeah, unfortunate. Sorry to hear that, but them's the facts these days, unfortunately. This has been a heck of a conversation. A lot of insight. The audience is commenting they really enjoyed it as well. You did a great job. Stick around. We'll talk off air. Don't go anywhere just yet. Okay. Before I say goodbye to them, any shout outs to anyone or anything you want to give?
I don't know who's really on. I saw that people from LinkedIn could be on it. I met a lot of nice people on LinkedIn, a lot of very interesting people. But I wish everyone in law enforcement the best. Good luck to you.
Yes, absolutely. Well, one person sends his regards. When I put the promo out on Facebook, he says he's known you since you guys were kids. He was an ESU cop. Patty Pogan says hi.
Who?
Patty Pogan. He says he grew up with you. He says he's known you since you guys were kids. He ended up working in Two Truck and the JTTF. I don't know if that name rings a bell.
Parkchester?
I don't know if it was in Parkchester, but he says he remembers you. Patty Pogan's his name. He's been on this show before. So I don't know what the connection is there, but I guess you guys must have crossed paths at some point.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe he was a detective from the police department. He came on, he did work at the DA's office.
Might have been, because he was in JTTF at the end of his career.
Okay.
So that's probably how you guys know each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in any event, he does send his regards, and I'll tell him you send your regards.
Tell him good. I hope everything's going well.
Yep, indeed. Certainly will. Again, thanks to everybody in the chat, whether you were watching tonight via YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And for those of you that listen to the audio side later on, coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, we're working on a guest for this Monday. We don't have anybody lined up right now. Fortunately, John Coughlin won't be in. We're going to reschedule that one. So hopefully we can get him on in January, ideally. So hopefully we will have a guest then. If we're not able to have one, I'll let you know. We do have a guest for Friday lined up, and looking forward to this one. He was an actor on many different shows, including Law & Order. And he was actually an NYPD captain for 24 years, and that's Joe Lisi, who'll be here next Friday at 6 p.m. Had definitely an interesting career between Law & Order, Third Watch, and many other shows he appeared on.
He worked in DOI. He worked in special narcotics too.
He did? Joe Lisi?
Yes. He was.
Idea.
Yes. Yes. And actually, I recognized him. It's funny because he was on Kojak.
He was.
And one day I was watching Kojak and I saw him. Yeah. Yeah. He worked in special narcotics. He was I believe a captain or a lieutenant.
He was captain, yeah.
When I got hired, he was the CO for there was a small NYPD unit. But yes, you can mention to him, if you remember, his name was Leon Schwartzman.
Okay.
That was the chief at the time. So, yeah. And, because he got replaced by a Irish guy named Jim McNulty, John McNulty. So he took him. Yeah, but yeah, he was gone. He left about a year after I got there. So he would know Sterling Johnson too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll definitely have to mention that when we're talking before the show goes on the air. Small world. I love that connection from guest to guest. So I'll definitely tell him that you said hello as well. All right. Like I said, stick around. We'll talk off there. Great job to producer Vick as always. And like I said, guys, we'll try to figure out a show for this Monday. For tonight's outro song on the audio side, a shout out to my buddy Steve Stefanakis from 10 Truck ESU for putting me on to this artist. It's from his 1986 album, Songs from the Film, The Late Great Tommy Keene, with Places That Are Gone. In the meantime, on behalf of producer Victor and John Fleming, I am Mike Colón. We will see you next time and have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe, take care, and stay warm. Thanks.